OK, cool. GM, hello everyone. Hope you're enjoying Masari mainnet. In this presentation today, I'm going to talk through what Blur is and how Blur became the #1 NFT marketplace on Ethereum in only 4 months. So for those of you who don't know, Blur is an NFT marketplace for pro traders. It's primarily on Ethereum. We do about 5 to 10 million in NFT trading volume every day. And as you can see here, Blur actually became the #1 NFT marketplace on Ethereum in only 4 months. So you can see on this chart, we have the orange volume share, which is Blur. Blue is OpenSea. So OpenSea was the #1 NFT marketplace prior to our launch. And then very quickly, Blur became the top marketplace. And in addition to this NFT marketplace, Blur also has a lending protocol called Blend. So basically, this lending protocol lets you get a loan against your NFT as collateral. And it's a peer-to-peer NFT lending protocol. And similar to the spot marketplace, Blend is also the #1 NFT lending protocol on Ethereum. You can see effectively, immediately, as soon as we launched Blend, it became the top NFT lending protocol by bar volume. And so what is Blur, actually? If you're not familiar, Blur is, again, like I mentioned, an NFT marketplace for pro traders. So you can see here on this main collections page, Blur is very data-oriented. This UI looks very much like Bloomberg, if you're familiar with it. So it kind of has this Bloomberg-esque feel. And you can't see it here because it's a slide, but all the data updates live in real time. Speed is a primary focus. And just to dig into it a little bit, when you go into the collections page, here you can see it's, again, very data-oriented. So on the left, you have your normal filters. Right? You can filter by the different attributes. This is what you would expect on an NFT marketplace. But in the middle, you'll see these are the different listings. And a lot of focus is placed on the data, right? The rarity, the last sale, the top bid, et cetera. You can see on the right, there's various charts. And here's another view that Blur provides with a little bit more data and charting. So on the right, you can see we have listings and sales split up. Right on the left, we have listings, and on the right, sales. Blur actually aggregates listings and sales across multiple marketplaces. So you can see in the sales history, there's one sale from OpenSea around 8 hours ago. Most of the sales are on Blur, of course. And then also, there's the sales chart and a depth chart, which shows you a more in-depth view and analytics around the trading history of the NFT. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the lending protocol, here's what that looked like. It's integrated right into the marketplace itself. So when you go to the Loans tab, here you can see a chart of all the loan liquidity as well as the active loans. So those dots right there are all the different loans. And here's another view of it. It's a table view. You can see here there's 262 active loans right now. And the top shows the loans in auction. Below, you can see the active loans. And hopefully, this just gives you an idea of what Blur is for those unfamiliar. So a question that we often get asked is, why did Blur succeed? If any of you are familiar with NFT marketplace history, you'll have known that in 2022, when Blur launched, there have already been multiple attempts at dethroning OpenSea. There was the Coinbase NFT marketplace. There was LooksRare. There was X2, Y2. There were dozens of well-funded, decently executed marketplace attempts prior to Blur's launch. And none of them were able to dethrone OpenSea. And before I get into specific tactics, I think it's important to lead with a little bit of theory. So the first thing to know is that network effects are basically impossible to compete against. I think a good example of this is if you look at Craigslist. Craigslist is a dinosaur of a product. They haven't changed in 20 years, probably more at this point. But Craigslist still does about $500 million every year in revenue. So it's this incredible business, hasn't really changed at all, very low, operationally light, only around 40 employees. And even though there's been so many marketplaces that have attacked different verticals of Craigslist, right, like Airbnb, StockX, various different verticalized marketplaces, Craigslist is still very dominant as a horizontal marketplace. So the key thing to understand is that network effects are basically impossible to compete against. The question then is, how did Blur compete against OpenSea's network effects? The thing about the NFT market is, because it's a financialized market, there was a huge missing opportunity in the space that most people had neglected prior to, pretty much every player had neglected prior to Blur's launch. And that was building a marketplace catered for pro traders. If you look at the history of most marketplaces, and especially financialized markets, there's a clear trend where the markets actually professionalize over time. So if you look in more retail-oriented markets like Airbnb, for example, the original hosts were just people renting out their spare bedrooms. Now there's professional hosts. They'll buy out entire complexes. They'll rent it out, and it's an entire business. Similarly with Uber, people were originally just driving on the side. Now you have full-time Uber drivers. Etsy, you had moms in Texas making products to sell on Etsy. And then now you have entire businesses, basically where their entire focus is just Etsy. So every single market effectively professionalizes over time. And especially in financialized markets, the markets professionalize to an extreme degree. So if you look at TradFi, for example, the vast majority of volume is done by a handful of market makers, right? This is your Citadel, Jane Streets of the world. It's like 5 players that basically does like all the volume. It's an incredibly strong power law effect. If you look at the token market, right, if you look at Coinbase, Binance, these kinds of exchanges, it's also a similar dynamic to a lesser degree than TradFi, but still very heavy power law. It's only a few market makers basically providing all of the liquidity, most of the volume. And the opportunity in NFTs was when we started Blur, you had those similar market dynamics, but there was no single platform that addressed the need for pro traders. So we knew from history that there is this huge gap, and there is a need for a professionalized platform, effectively. And none of it existed in the market. So that was the first key ingredient. And then how do we actually put that into practice? So the key thing for pros, if anyone has read Flash Boys, you'll know speed is incredibly important. And of course, data and analytics. So we focused on building the fastest NFT marketplace. Here you can see a comment from one of our early users. Blur is so fast, I thought it was wrong. Just took a while to update on everything else. So we built an incredibly fast NFT marketplace. And something that most people are not aware of is, if any of you have heard of Blur, you might associate Blur with our airdrop program, which was a very successful incentivization program. And most people assume that we actually just launched right out the gate with this airdrop program, and that most of the activity and product market fit came from these tokenomics, effectively. But that is actually very far from the truth. What we actually did was we stayed in private beta for about 6 months, just as a NFT aggregator. So it was basically a tool to trade NFTs. We didn't have any sort of airdrop program. We didn't have any sort of marketing campaign. And we stayed in private beta until we had achieved product market fit. And we measured product market fit by looking at retention. So here you can see our visitor retention. The 30-day visitor retention was in the 40 to 60% range across different cohorts. So what that means is that if someone visited Blur during our private beta, then 30 days later, about 40 to 60% of those visitors would come back to Blur. And if any of you are familiar with Web 2 growth metrics, you'll know that that is best in class, not just for Web 3, but also across the Web 2 space. And even more importantly, our transaction retention was in the 30 to 50% range. So again, what this means is if someone transacted on Blur in our private beta, so this was if someone bought a listing or listed on Blur, then 30 days later, around 50% of those people would come back and use the product again. And again, this was all during this private beta period where there was no incentivization program or growth campaign whatsoever. And then finally, we launched with an airdrop program that we became known for. And again, a lot of people don't actually understand where this airdrop program came from. One of the nice things about launching so late, so we launched in October of 2022. One of the nice things about launching that late is that there was a lot of history that we could look at. So we looked to DeFi as an example, because if you think of Blur as an NFT marketplace protocol, if you squint, it looks very similar to a DEX for tokens. And there were numerous DEXs that we could look at. One of the DEXs that had a very successful token program is Curve, of course. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Curve, Curve is a stablecoin DEX. And the way that Curve works is that it actually incentivizes stablecoin liquidity. And what they do is, by incentivizing this liquidity, they actually make it more convenient for people to trade on Curve than on other exchanges. And what we did with Blur is we actually took a very similar approach. And our airdrop program basically incentivized listing and bidding. And importantly, similar to Curve, Blur incentivized liquidity and not volume. The issue with incentivizing volume, and there's a lot of examples in history that you can look at, is when you incentivize volume, it directly translates to wash trading. If you looked at other marketplaces, that NFT marketplaces prior to Blur, like Looksrare and X2Y2, you'll have noticed that they use a volume incentive, and the vast majority of their volume was wash trading. And while this leads to short-term metric boosts, it doesn't lead to retention and real network effects. And if you zoom back a bit and you look at the token trading world, there are other examples. So Curve incentivized liquidity, but prior to Curve, there was an exchange called Fcoin. Some of you might remember it. And Fcoin, again, they incentivize volume and not liquidity. And so they had crazy volume metrics, but this was just all wash trading from people trading tokens back and forth with each other. And instead, what Curve did and what Blur did is we incentivize liquidity. So on Blur, there's actually no reward for trading on the marketplace. But the reason why traders come is because the liquidity incentive made it so that you could get a better price buying and selling on Blur than anywhere else. And then coupled with the NFT marketplace aggregator that we already knew had best-in-class retention, it became a very powerful effect. So we incentivize this with the Blur token, which is a governance token modeled after Uniswap. It controls treasury grants, governance parameters, also the protocol fee rate, again, similar to Uniswap. And we think of this as, by rewarding the users who provided liquidity and giving them this token, they basically had a stake in the success of Blur, and they would basically be able to reap the rewards of their efforts. Another way of thinking of the token is effectively a index on the NFT market. And so by combining this market opportunity, which was NFT marketplace for pro traders, previously untapped, with a product that already had best-in-class retention, and an airdrop program that incentivized the right actions, which is providing liquidity over volume, that's how Blur became the #1 NFT marketplace in only 4 months and has maintained that dominant position. Thank you.